Brooklyn Independent Television.
Hey, it's a big
But
boat.
will Brooklyn really go for
Why
it?
don't we just agree to disagree?
Yeah, that's really gonna fly in
Well, that's a
Brooklyn.
good question.
No. Listen.
That's exactly the point I wanted to make.
Here in Brooklyn, Superstorm Sandy is one of those before and after moments. We are securely on the after side, but what comes after the after? Millions have already been raised and tens of billions of dollars are on the way. But on the way to where, and who will benefit the most from the rebuilding funds? This is Intersect, and today we're talking Sandy dollars. I'm joined by Valerie Jean, the Executive Director of Families United for Racial and Economic Equality, FURY, and Lisa Cowan, the Board Director of the Red Hook Initiative. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
So right before we get started, I guess the quote that inspired this line of thinking from me and then finding out about your perspectives on the subject is City Council Member Brad Lander. Right before Thanksgiving, you know, everyone was really involved in the spirit of cleanup and recovery in Sandy and giving thanks for everything that we have, even if it wasn't as much as before, and organized this petition on MoveOn.org, and he was sending an open letter to the mayor and the other city council members. But in part it said, this is from City Council Member Lander, will we simply rebuild what was there before, a city divided by inequality and poverty, vulnerable to climate change with government decisions too often driven by corporate interest rather than the public interest? Or will we rebuild on the remarkable spirit of organized compassion we've seen and try to create a city where everyone is protected and no one is homeless? Will we rebuild two cities or one? So that, I think, encapsulated a feeling that so many people who thought 5 minutes past the immediate need that was so naked and apparent right then. So we're sitting here 3 months later, and how do you think we're doing on that rebuilding? Are we staying the course, or do you see the discord coming already, if it is coming?
Well, I think one of the great things about Brad is that he is an optimist, and in my moments of optimism, I feel like there really was an opportunity here. I mean, you saw it in the people who showed up during the storm, you saw it in the philanthropic giving afterwards, and it was this moment where people from different neighborhoods really were in each other's lives, where middle-class people were walking through public housing, which doesn't typically happen. And so maybe we have gained some better understanding of the disparity in the city, and maybe we will be able to incorporate that into some of the rebuild. It's not completely clear to me how or if that will happen, but I'm crossing my fingers and we're working on it.
Right. And I agree with Lisa in the same way that we have to be reminded of what went down in New Orleans, right? Mm-hmm. Right after Katrina and Rita hit, and how, although there were millions and billions of dollars that had funneled down there, that there were still disparities in how those monies and those dollars were spent. And so when we think about a New York City under Mayor Bloomberg, where we've seen historically, we say historically because it's like 12 years now, what has gone on in neighborhoods through rezoning and urban planning that has created pockets of inequality, right? Pockets of poverty in communities. We have to be just as diligent and mindful of, like, you know, what happens with the $50 billion aid that's just been passed by Congress. How is that going to be spent in low-income and working communities, not just in New York, but across the Atlantic seaboard? And so, yes, it is, hopeful. We are very hopeful that those dollars will be spent with some equity in it. But we also have to be mindful that, we still have the same government in place. We still have the same people in place who are vying for, for money that's going to serve their needs and still leave many of the families that we work with in the dark.
So speaking of the sort of the before moments and the things that we still have a lot of structures in place that were there before and will endure, your organizations are two of those structures that have been doing positive work. There have been so many phenomenal things that have come out of a moment of crisis here in Brooklyn, with people really snapping into action. But both FURY and the Red Hook Initiative have been predating the storm, thankfully. So I want to ask you, we'll start with you, Lisa, to tell us about the work that the Red Hook Initiative has done before, and how the storm has sort of changed that whole perspective.
Yeah. Well, we are about 10 years old. We started really as a prenatal education program in the Red Hook houses, and as we, Jill Eisenhard, who's the director and founder, was working with some women, training them to be pure health educators, really around prenatal health. And when we opened a weekend space, we found that it was the young people who showed up, that it was girls who showed up looking for programming. And so the organization has always really responded to the needs of the people in front of us. And so we evolved into a youth development organization working with kids from middle school through age 24 around education advocacy, physical and mental health education, employment, and community development. And we have about 85 people on staff, 90% of whom live in Red Hook, and that's always been a really critical part of our work, is to employ people in the community to design and deliver programs. And really, until whatever it was, October 29th, we had not thought for a minute about disaster or disaster relief.
Right.
And so our challenge going forward is to stay true to our mission and also continue to address the need that's right in front of us, figure out what it makes sense for us to take on and where we're partnering to make sure that the needs we see are being addressed, even if we're not the ones to address them.
So Valerie, in the case of Fury, it might be more difficult for some people to see the through line there from your mission as it's stated and what we know of the organization, and now dealing with the response to the hurricane and the things that are coming after. So sort of give us a roadmap of the organization and how you guys have adapted and changed to fit needs after the storm.
Sure. So Fury was founded 11 years ago by 15 women living on public assistance to fight for what is now the Local Law 23, the Access to Education and Training Law. And it was really rooted in looking at, if we really want to move families out of poverty, we need to create spaces for that opportunity to happen without interference by public policy or practices that impact primarily low-income and working class women of color. And since then, we've connected our work or the work around welfare rights to other issues dealing with economic equity, racial equity, and gender equity. And our current campaigns now are looking at how do we increase access to jobs, to access to low-income housing, as well as increasing and preserving services that help families to move and exit out of poverty. And so we normally did not organize Gowanus residents. We received a phone call from one of our board members, Beverly Corbin, who lives in Wyckoff Gardens, who had a conversation with the Tennis Association president there, and who I spoke to the Friday after Sandy hit, and she was like, we've been without power and heat and hot water. There are about 5 buildings in the development that were impacted by the Gowanus Canal flooding their electrical and heating systems. And that they were generally were not getting any help. City Council member Steve Levin and Assemblywoman Joan Millman were working to try to figure out what is the answer, what is NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, doing around that. Right. And there's been no response. And so a few hours right after the phone call, we were already on the ground, started reaching out to people and started to get supplies in to make sure that the immediate needs of residents were met, and to begin to make assessments of who was there, who were homebound, who had illnesses, who had young babies, so that we can continue to provide that work. And when you think about the work that Fury does, in a very simple but complex way to really talk about it, it's just how do we really address the needs that are keeping us from being stable? And so we couldn't, ignore that call. We couldn't ignore, here's a community that's right in the middle of, Burham Hill and Park Slope, and, everything around them is going on okay, but have somehow been forgotten in the midst of all of this. And moving forward, we have to think about, as I said earlier, with all of the funding that is coming through, how do we ensure that families that are in communities that have been impacted by Sandy, but also in communities that didn't receive a lot of media attention, are getting the aid that they need, right? 2 days ago, the pipes in Gowanus were frozen and went out, and they're currently without, heat and hot water again, and these kind of things, they continue. And so we want, to as an organization, want to make sure that we're there to help develop leaders from the Gowanus community and other communities to forcefully and unapologetically advocate for the funding that is needed to repair their homes.
And Red Hook was famously the Red Hook houses offline for a while after the storm, and there was a lot of attention paid, which was like mind-boggling that we are like going about so much of our regular days, and then knowing that this entire a village, just because a vertical village essentially, is completely left dangling out there. And it really sort of illustrates the point of these events, these tragic events or acts of whether nature or God, such an equalizer. Where across the board, if the water comes, the water's coming. Whether you live in the most expensive zip code in Brooklyn and New York City now, Boerum Hill, or if you're feet away in the Gowanus houses, it's such an equalizer, but at the same time, it really highlights the stark difference where the folks in Red Hook were without power and heat for weeks, but the stock exchange is open the next day.
Right. Well, I mean, even more graphic than that, I mean, I think the thing that is, was sort of to the advantage of both Gowanus and Red Hook is that it was such a conveniently located disaster. There we are in the middle of Brownstone, Brooklyn, where people did have power and were going about normal life and could bake a tray of ziti and bring it over, run to Costco and come back. Right. And that was great for getting those immediate needs made, but it was also this incredibly disturbing and graphic reminder of the differences that 2 blocks can make.
Right. Yes. I'm like struck by that all over again, and that it's as awful as it sounds, and I promise there's no pun intended. It comes in waves because we are at one point and we think we're so far removed from something, and then something happens, and you're right back there in the same position. So have you had those moments organizationally or personally walking around as you move through this thing?
Yeah, I mean. So the reason that Red Hook Initiative was able to play the role it did was because we don't have a basement, we had nothing to get flooded, and so we didn't lose power. And because our staff literally lives across the street, they could cross the street the next day, open the door to see were we flooded, what happened, and just plug in. Everyone and then we just opened the doors for people to start plugging in. And then literally volunteers on bikes came by and saw there were lights on and came in. And all of a sudden, there were thousands of people coming through our offices. And so, sort of from one moment to the next, it felt like this miracle that all these people were showing up to help. And then we felt like, wait, we have an organization in here somewhere, and what about the kids who we'd like to have programs for? And like nobody knew who we were or what we did. Yeah. I've kind of lost your original question, but
that's what's happened. You are responding and adapting to things as they come. But even speaking about that, people like just happening upon you and saying, "All right, use me," and those things that come after that, we're a little bit removed from that, where now it's the money chase, where the organizations who've existed and those who are springing up, and then some kind of consortium of those who've been and those who are filling needs out of their own pockets or wherever that money is coming from, just doing what they can. So what's it been like for you guys? I know that it's not as readily accessible as people saying, well, I made a donation to these people, and then you go knock on the door and say, well, the money's going here, or you have to do this. What's the process been like of getting the funding to continue to do that work?
To continue to do post-relief work?
Or even to start, because you were in one lane, and by necessity, you have to go to the other lane and still cover this, like you're saying, but we don't want the voice of these young women and the people we've been serving all this time to get lost, and there's so many other needs that are coming in. So what's it been like for you guys evolving from one thing into the next realm of what you're gonna be?
Right. I mean, it's, as with any organizational transition, you want to make sure that your fundraising is in line with your mission and, and so on. And so thankfully we had the support of our existing funders, who reached out. Like they reached out and they were like, look, we know this is happening here. We're sending a check on the way. Like, it's okay. Do whatever you need to do with it. Yeah. And then also thankfully a lot of our donors also stepped up in ways that were just like, You see it normally during your annual event, but like this time around, they were like, look, like let us know what you need. And but then what was also good in a way was like, we worked with residents from Gowanus to lead the efforts there. So, we also had like a set of residents that were going to area restaurants and supermarkets and pharmacies and asking for donations and building relationships with pharmacists to make sure that prescriptions were being refilled. But the funding afterwards, right? And then I think a lot of times when we think about disaster response, we think about the emergency response and don't always think about the long-term needs of people who've been impacted by disaster, right? What are the psychosocial needs? A lot of things were revealed in Gowanus, from grandmothers taking their children's asthma medicine to deal with their COPD because they don't have, their Medicaid or Medicare was decertified, and they haven't been able to make that appointment to get recertified. So there are the long-term needs afterwards, particularly in Gowanus, where it wasn't eligible initially for those initial benefits assistance that people were getting, that other communities were getting. DSNAP program, right, and still isn't. Right, and still isn't. And it's like, it's this fight. It's because of, it's located in a zip code where the median income is way higher than what it is to be eligible for those kinds of assistance. So it's like, it's been this, constant tug of war. And then the fundraising part of it has been, it's been challenging in some ways, because for Fury, like, we want to be real about, well, we're not in Coney Island, we're not in Red Hook, right? Like, Gowanus families are sort of kind of doing okay. The fight that we have to do has to be more on ensuring that the housing authority is doing what it needs to do. But then we also know that the lack of additional services that is targeting that particular development is impacting, the recovery of families afterwards. And so it's been, for us, trying to figure out like what's the right way to move without removing resources from other organizations that could be doing that work, with a more direct population, but also understanding that, we still have a role to play in making sure that the funding gets moved, that it's spent the right way, and particularly for housing authority work, that residents are involved in the planning and the implementation of these projects.
So and in the long run, that is like every bit as important as making sure people have dinner tonight.
Oh yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Moving forward, what sort of solutions-based things are we seeing on the horizon? We know that this money is coming. We know that the electeds have a brief window to sort of get in there. So that means you have an even briefer window in an environment where, as a nonprofit, I'm sure it was not all roses before the water came.
Right. I mean, I think that, right there, I would say people talk a lot about what's the ongoing need. And what I would say is that we had like a very strong, fast, graphic disaster, but before that, we had a long, slow, grinding disaster. And the needs are not that different. I mean, there's more mold than there was, but I saw you two talking about mold months ago, right? Still nobody's getting their repairs done. Still people don't have good jobs. Still there are crappy schools in these neighborhoods. And so that is work that we were already doing, and that I think is also part of, our aspiration to build a more just city.
So where is the mold is a great point, and now it's like the people are, a larger body is going to know what it's like to live with mold and mold abatement, and then there's a whole other vocabulary that's being introduced to a lot of people in the community right now. But where are those points of light, to borrow something from
someone a while ago.
Right, that's another story. But where are those the opportunities? Like, jobs are going to be created. Things are going to have to be built and reconstructed, and new systems in place, and thinking about sustainability. So where would you like to get in? Where do you see yourself saying, okay, this has to happen, we need to be a part of this? Like, I'm from construction to even just saying, you know what, we are in a food desert. We need a grocery store where there was a vacant lot. You want to send a crew out to test the soil? Well, let's put a garden here, or let's put in a grocery. Like, what is there a wish list sort of thing?
Yeah, well, that would take about an hour.
I don't know what our timing is, but I'm sure there's some things on top of the list for you guys.
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, the biggest thing is creating sustainable communities from this, from this disaster. We have to be real about that. Climate change is here. We always thought of climate change as something that happened in the South, in the West, and and so on. But it's here. It's happening in New York. This is our second year dealing with a hurricane that scared all of us. And so where we would like to see the money is definitely, as it pertains to public housing, to ensure that there's a clear, viable plan that includes the input of residents that is dealing with disaster recovery, remediation, and mitigation, right? And the monies that are coming in to definitely employ the Section 3 policies that calls for hiring residents, and not just hiring them, but training them and ensure that they are certified to do the work that needs to be done, whether it's, like moving a resident out of an apartment because it's dangerous for that person to be in there without electricity, to making sure that actual mold remediation is happening. We still work with residents, so we'll hear like, oh, the remediation is happening, it's just they're just throwing bleach in the walls and slapping some paint on it, and so we want to, and when we talk about sustainability, it's not just about like, having access to money, but having access to stability for families to feel like, okay, I can be comfortable living here. I can rest my head at night and not worry about the health of myself and my children. And then other monies as it pertains to construction in larger communities is to employ residents that live in the communities that are impacted and still dealing with those impacts from Sandy. Right. Many people have not been able to work during the time that they were unable to get out of their apartments. Lost their food, lost their medication, had to figure out what was going on with family members who were not in the area without having communication and so on. And so these are all very real impacts, particularly to low-income communities where you're already like unstable with your income, where you're already struggling to put food on the table or pay your bills. And why not invest in that economy, right? Like why not help, use this disaster as a way to help build that local economy so that, maybe hopefully when a disaster does happen, you have like, rapid response teams that are ready to go, that contains neighbors, that is made up of neighbors who are, when they knock on somebody's door, somebody be like, oh, that's Joe from across the hall. I can trust him. I can open that door and let him know what's going on with me and my family. But I think it's going to take not just relying on our elected officials, like we really appreciate them, but something that we say at Fury where we don't have power in money, we have power in numbers. And it's really important that, no matter what community people are from, that they are paying attention to how that money is moving. And when the calls to action go out, whether it's signing a petition, forwarding an email, posting something on Facebook, or showing up, to a hearing, that the same people who were able to come through public housing to deliver food upstairs, we really ask their support, to add on to the voices for calling for accountability and how those funds are spent.
So I read that quote from Brad Lander earlier, and he is someone who is forward-thinking and looking at that long-term view. And, Ready, it seems to lead the Coalition of the Willing and all those people who rode their bikes down and said, hey, put me to work. So what do we need to do as citizens, in your opinion, Lisa, to help them to make sure that this isn't Brooklyn's Katrina moment? We've learned a lot since then. So in your opinion, how do we get over that hurdle from what we don't have to repeat the mistakes they made?
Right. Well, I think what I hope is that we're on a trajectory where people go from thinking of this as their charity work that they did during the storm to thinking of this as the way they are citizens, the way they're engaged. And I think, to Valerie's point about making sure that these are issues that are not just for the people living in those houses, but for all of us living in Brooklyn, ideally living in the city, ideally living on the planet. But, we can start smaller than that. And so I think it's incumbent on us to make sure that these issues do stay in the limelight, and that we take this moment to keep talking about this stuff so that, when people are done sort of serving that Thanksgiving meal in the soup kitchen and go back home, that they know that it's not really over. Yeah, because there was, there was so much interest and so much concern that shown. And, so we can be our better selves, and we just need to figure out how to structure that. And at the same time, hold public institutions responsible so that we're not having sort of private citizens do what our government should be doing.
Right. Well, speaking of government and what they should be doing, I would be remiss while I have you here to not talk about Mayor Bloomberg's announcement yesterday that he intends...
the mold mayor!
Well, is going to be a legacy piece. Before he gets out of office, he's going to clear that backlog of the problems in NYCHA and get residents up to code, essentially. So what's the feeling in the community?
He's talking about doing that with private funds, right?
Well...
Break it down. Let us know what's happening about it.
Well, I'm not sure about the private funds part. I mean, I'm still in shock about we're going to fix what we haven't been able to fix over the past 15 years in a 12-month period.
Before I get out of here,
Right, and I just think that it's I'm one of those I hope so.
Yep.
I really hope so, but I'll believe it when I see it. you know, and I think that it doesn't take into account, right, the new repair issues that are coming up because of the hurricane, you know, and it doesn't take into account that, you know, a lot of the repair issues that are there have been there for a few years. It wasn't like, you know, this little crack in the wall. Now it's like this whole wall has to come down. And in the midst of this economy, like, you know, I'm unsure. Like, I'm unsure how to respond to that, because I'm like, you know, let's be responsible and not put the hopes up of residents and say that you're going to complete something in a year when clearly it hasn't happened in so many years, right? And clearly is still a problem even with post-Sandy repair issues that have come up. Yeah.
So we also are sitting here right now when lines are being redrawn or flood zones and all of that mapping stuff just came from the folks at FEMA, and these things are being finalized, and new evacuation zones are being drawn on the city level. So do you think that that's going to have an impact, particularly in those coastal communities? And what impact does that have on a lot of people who are like in public housing and renting? We've heard a lot of like people think of FEMA as for homeowners, and those are the recovery funds. And there's so many issues that people who are renters and people who are that are facing, and they are sort of feel like they've been left out there to fend for themselves. So have you guys had to answer a lot of those questions, or has that been a concern for people who aren't homeowners, who are saying like, I don't even know where to go to get this fixed, or what avenues do you go down?
Right. Well, I mean, it's tough to just move those buildings a mile inland, you know, that would be
well,
ideal.
You know, like the governor's talking about buying these, like buying up the oceanfront houses kind of thing for some of these people and letting that land go fallow, like making them offers on their homes to move away. Do you see this as a moment that could be, I spoke about before and after, but a really changing moment in the lives of a lot of New Yorkers, and particularly NYCHA residents? Is this a first step in sort of deconstructing that plan? Is that even something that seems conceivable?
That would be step 5.
Yeah.
You know, because you have to think back to New Orleans, where, like, you know, the Housing Authority of New Orleans used Hurricane Katrina as an excuse to completely remove residents from public housing when the waters didn't even touch them.
But
waters didn't even touch the public housing developments. Like, you know, hours after Katrina hit, they locked up all the doors, and then weeks later they were throwing everybody's furniture out the window.
Okay, I'm sorry that we are completely out of time. And I didn't mean to even go there, because that is for the next time. I hope that you two come back and join us, and we'll get all into that. But I'd like to thank my guests, Valerie Jean, the Executive Director of Fury, and Lisa Cowan, the Board Chair of the Red Hook Initiative. We'll see you next time. Bye now.
Watch this and other Brooklyn Independent Television episodes online at brickartsmedia.org/BIT.